So, as Yuri said, when he asked me to participate in this, I was happy since I wanted to come in any case, and this made it something that I knew I had to schedule. But as he probably also conveyed, if he didn't say it exactly, I'm not really a member of, he's really kind of worked out a kind of cohort of people working on Cinemetrics. And I'm not part of that, nor do I even exactly understand it. But I figured, therefore, that my role here is partly that of almost a kind of an audience, a bit like you, a little bit of a surrogate, perhaps, in that respect. But one who's going to talk back and who's going to indicate to open up some of my questions and some of my preconceptions and even some of my skepticisms and curiosities about this whole issue. Yuri has indicated that in some way I was kind of, the germ that started him off on this frenzy. And I'm actually quite proud of that, to hear that. And it is absolutely true that many of the things that this method is intended to do are things that I think are both very important and that in some way I have kind of participated in. The one thing I will have to announce right off is that I know practically nothing about statistics, which is part of the method, as I understand it, of Cinemetrics. And one of the things that I think we're going to learn about from people who do know something about it here. So I don't want my ignorance to indicate some sense of not wanting to enter into the issue. It's rather just that I've never quite done it thoroughly. I do, as I say, have some questions about it, but I'm also here very essentially to kind of learn. And when I've looked at the Cinemetrics website, I've been both extremely intrigued and extremely confused at points. So I hope that both of those things will be addressed here. The first thing that I want to kind of contextualize this meeting of people about a Numerate film history, which is a very interesting term that Yuri and his group have come up with for this conference, is the fact that there is always a way that cinema tends to have an interaction with other disciplines. And I at one point thought that I should characterize this by saying that cinema is kind of by nature a slut. And constantly, making other types of unions. But then I thought maybe it would be more appropriate, although I've already said the nasty thing, to say cinema is an orphan, always looking for parents, always looking for guidance, and always in some way insecure about its own methods. I think both of these are not totally reprehensible. They both have value, both socially and in terms of enriching our lives. And I don't want to indicate that I think in some way cinema should be alone. I think that is an independent and not interacting with these other disciplines. I think this is actually an essential part of what cinema is. It's something that that brings in, that swallows up other disciplines. All of us who have studied film studies, particularly from its beginnings in the 70s, know this kind of successive models that have been swallowed up and which people had to master to various degrees, semiotics, psychoanalysis, linguistics, literary criticism. And although I think there are definitely damages and distortions that came from those encounters, there's no question that they also enriched, particularly after a period of digestion and criticism, what cinema is and what cinema could do. So what I want to do partly today is this kind of intro, which I don't think is a keynote in the true sense. The keynote will be about Keystone, I think, is to indicate, as I say, something of my skepticism, that is to say, my questions about what a Numerate film history would be. And then also, as I say, very much, the skepticism is triggered and balanced by a sense of curiosity and indeed a sense of kind of expectations. So in any case, though, I wanted to begin with a clip from a film. This is just partly to get us in the mood. It's a film that nobody likes but me, I think. It's a film by director Otto Preminger that was universally kind of agreed to be his worst film. I think it's quite amazing. It's a film he did in 1972, I believe, called Skidoo, which has one of the most outrageous plots ever, which is it's about the encounter between hippies and the mafia. And part of it involves Jackie Gleason, who plays a mafia boss, who's assigned to go into a prison to kill an informer, but who gets hooked up with the kind of hippie genius played by Austin Pendleton, and convinced, or rather actually accidentally ingests LSD. Now in the 70s there was this period in which lots of movies showed acid trips, you know, by using different types of special effects. And this is one of them, and the special effects are not particularly good. Though I do think the idea of an acid trip by Jackie Gleason is in itself intriguing. And one of the things I might find most fascinating is where he has, you know, because this is a time when it was believed that LSD not only induced wild, deviant behavior, but also deep metaphysical insights. So I want you to see where his metaphysical insights end up. And it's in CinemaScope, so I will get to the side. So, Izu, when you are ready. Yes, the head of the mafia in the film, just to give you a sense while we're vamping here, is played by Groucho Marx, and he's known as, and his name is God. So there's a credit actually of, and Groucho Marx as God. Okay, so this is a little earlier than I intended to start, but it's fine. This is fine. Could you bring down the lights just a bit, though?
They have a high ego retention. Most members of the establishment have. They don't realize the beauty of life without...
A little louder volume.
They don't realize the beauty of an egoless life.
I'm on a trip.
Tough Tony. Your time has come, wherein all things are like the void and cloudless sky, and the naked, spotless intellect is like a transparent vacuum.
Professor, I'm scared.
You need not be frightened. Just remember, wherever you go, you're still here.
Leech. Leech.
Oh, Tough Tony. The time has come to seek out the clear light. Light is the flame of your life. Your energy is the life process. Do not fear it. Surrender to it. Join it. It is part of you. You are part of it. Remember the final reality, the all good, the all peaceful, the light. The radiance, let mind and body separate.
What's he see? I see mathematics. 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 He's got a loose screw.
Okay, you can stop there. Okay. So, numbers are many things, and of course they have a very numerous roles within our society. And one of the key things about them that I think we need to keep in mind is that they're in some sense abstract. They're self-referential. the logic of arithmetic and math does not have to refer to the world at all. Although, of course, I think one can argue, and I think no one would deny it, that arithmetic begins in counting things, but it soon establishes its own kind of independence in it, and that's partly why, for Jackie Gleason or Tough Tony, it can become the image of the infinite, of all the possibilities of human consciousness. Numbers would seem, and this is partly cued by the dialogue in this sequence about the egoless existence, which supposedly LSD will lead you into, as something that will eliminate subjectivity. So it not only can eliminate things, in a sense, or at least abstract from things, it can also eliminate subjective judgment. And I think part of the attraction of numbers in the humanities, which I think is a good thing, but something that we should keep in mind, is that it seems to be in some way objective, that is to say, not subjective, not based on individual will or interpretation, which seems to be the main method of most of the humanities. Now, this term, numerate, which I'm not even sure if it's an actual word, but we all understand it, is obviously based partly on the idea of literate. If everyone who studies cinema needs to be literate, don't they need to be numerate? And I would tend to say yes, and furthermore emphasize the kind of contrast that this makes. Cinema is made up of neither words nor numbers, but images. I mean, words, of course, are spoken and occasionally appear on the screen, but what we think of as cinema is primarily moving images. And I think this raises a problem constantly, which we all have to reinvent again and again, although hopefully with some progress from the previous reinventions, is the idea of how do we analyze images, which of course is thousands of years old as a question, or at least 1,000 years old, and also how do we analyze moving images. And the idea that numbers might help us with this is, it seems to me, extremely important. Okay, so arguably this is one of the beginnings. Cinema has many beginnings depending on what we mean by beginning and what we mean by cinema. But one of its beginnings is this, which is known as the sneeze, sometimes known as Fred Ott sneeze, sometimes known as a Edison kinescopic record of a sneeze, which is possibly its most proper title because it was used in copywriting it. It's one of the first films that was supposedly publicized. This image of its various frames was published in Harper's Weekly, and with a story. And what I want to point out is that immediately with this announcement of Edison's new invention, one of the things that was said about it wasn't that it made a moving picture, although that was discussed, but that it had some 14,000, is the exact number, I can't remember it exactly, 14,486, something like that, photographs. In other words, cinema by its nature is a variety of single images, and from the very beginning it was wedded to number by the description of its nature being a large number of still photographs assembled. Now, one of the things that's very interesting, and if you haven't seen this, you can look at it in numerous versions on the web, is it was probably never shown as a film until much later. It was presented exactly as a page of photographs in Harper's Weekly. And this idea of it being individual discrete frames that could be counted and whose number, whose total was publicized in the first announcement of cinema seems to me to prove Uri's point that from the very beginning there's something about cinema and numbers that weds them together. Now, part of that, of course, will lead to the average shot length of major motion pictures, in this case by Stanley Kubrick, in which we're not just dealing with frames, but we're dealing with shots and their averages. We'll talk about this more, but I just wanted to indicate this kind of full extent of a Numerate film history from counting individual frames in the very first moving image, or one of the very first moving images, to this statistical computation of average shot lengths. The sneeze, though, I also want to point out is something very curious. Supposedly, Edison brought in a reporter from the Harper's Weekly, a man named Brandon Phillips, to see his new invention. And he said, what do you want me to do a film of? Make a kinographic record of. And the reporter supposedly said, a pretty young woman sneezing. There were no pretty young women in the Edison lab, this being a male domain, so they got Fred Ott, who was one of the engineers who both worked on the kinematograph and on the phonograph, and they got him to take some snuff and sneeze. But one of the things I want to point out is sneeze is something that's very bizarre. And there was, in fact, around the same time as this record was made, Winsor McCay's great comic strip, Little Sammy Sneeze, which had for a total plot that at the very first frame, a little boy would begin going, and by the end he would say, ka-choo, and cause some disaster here. My favorite, probably everybody's favorite, he actually breaks down the frame itself. So it's interesting to me also that you have this kind of, when we sneeze, probably the farthest thing from our mind is numbers, this kind of spasm of the body, and the interest in a way, breaking it down, giving it a series of numbers, measuring it, a whole series of things, which I think is essential to the whole idea of where cinema comes from, which of course begins with Eadweard Muybridge, begins again with many things, but one of its beginnings is Eadweard Muybridge's filming of a horse trotting, or galloping in this case, and getting the individual images of the individual seconds. As I've pointed out often in my writing, the key thing about Muybridge and then Etienne Jules Maret's analytical chronophotography, photographs of time, was that it could break down a continuous action into a series of discrete moments, instants. In fact, instants that were beyond the threshold of human perception, which is extremely important. The whole point is being that nobody had ever seen a horse's legs at those positions, and this upset painters enormously. But what should be emphasized is still nobody has seen it. Only the camera has seen it. We've seen photographs of it. This is something we cannot see. But it is something that we can number. And of course, all of these discrete frames can be enumerated, measured in time. They institute a kind of grid that we put over a common perceptual experience in the hope of trying, in some sense, to control it. However, I want again to kind of emphasize this conflict between the experience of watching a horse gallop, trot, whatever, the experience of sneezing or watching someone sneeze, and the process of filtering it through an apparatus that will break it into discrete intervals and allow it to be measured. Because in many ways, this question of the disparity between number and machine, on the one hand, and actual flow of life on the other, is essential. As you may know, French equestrian painters were very disturbed by these images because not only had they never painted anything like them, but they really thought they were pretty ugly. I mean, look at, ones on the left there. These are images they didn't want to imitate. And in fact, they claimed that Muybridge, had faked these, and that they, as skilled painters, could tell this. Now, Muybridge went to Paris, where he gathered with painters to prove by animating, by putting these into motion, by some of the first animated moving image projections, that in fact these were stages of motion. They weren't just odd, awkward, random moments. And one of the people who was in the audience, most of the creme de la creme of the French social and intellectual life were there, was the sculptor Auguste Rodin. And Rodin saw the proof, as it would be, and he said, yes, but nonetheless, they're not true, because time never stops. So in other words, he was pointing out that something that's happening here, which is a function of the machine, is not a function of human perception. This leads also to a kind of controversy that arises in the early part of the 20th century, soon after cinema developed, particularly by the philosopher Henri Bergson, who was interested in the way that Western thought had ignored motion and movement and the processes of perception that people have in everyday life. And he particularly emphasized that, things like the Achilles and the tortoise paradox from Zeno, which is inherited from classical thought, typify a way that we tend to think statically, and that we tend to divide every bit of motion into static points. And that's why, in this logic, Achilles can never catch up with the tortoise, even though, in fact, any child can tell you that clearly Achilles can beat the tortoise, even if the tortoise is given a head start. What's interesting is Bergson, in attacking this old and even ancient question, related it to the cinema and said there's a kind of this illusion that we can create motion through static points actually comes from what he called, anachronistically, since it went back to the Greeks at least, the cinematographic illusion. In other words, the way that cinema breaks things into still motions, or still images, fragments of motion, increments that can be numbered and counted, was for him why it was not a convincing illusion of motion. Now, it's very unclear what Bergson actually meant about cinema, because he was using it more as an illustration. And there are a lot of debates back and forth about whether he really intended to critique the movies, which were just appearing at that time, and indeed to what extent he'd actually seen any. But the key point is that, of course, in the production of a motion picture, there's often used here the term illusion, and I think it's a big problem, but I won't get into that here. There is a kind of interaction between a machine moving at a rapid rate, but non-continuously, the camera, and human perception, which actually creates in the perceiver an appearance of motion. And indeed, although at one point people thought they could explain this with the idea of persistence of vision, we now realize it's very complex, and indeed there is controversy about how to explain it, and no absolute agreement on exactly what the mental and physical processes are that involve this. That, in other words, in some ways, it still is something a mystery, although something that no one can deny. The fact that from a series of discrete frames, we gather motion. This is essential to, and this is actually a still camera, it's the best illustration I could find quickly, to the idea of the shutter, which came into photography late, only at the point that we're having very brief exposures in photography, and in which we are seizing that increment of time which the human eye cannot see. And you can see that there, and the hole is what the light will penetrate through in a camera to make an exposure, and this circular thing with the larger opening inside it is the shutter, which will allow that to open and cut off in very brief increments. Now, and Isu, if you can do the Lone-Dale operator, you can begin setting that up, and I'll just be talking while that would be good. What I want to say now is, okay, so what does all this technical background, particularly the invention of cinema, have to do with the type of project which is, going to tell us something about, Eyes Wide Shut or Spartacus, later films that are very, very different. And I guess what I want to say is that I think the issues that it raises are still very much the same issues. In other words, what's the relation between cutting and individual frames and our actual experience of the film? What I'm always worried about whenever one draws up a sense of tables and numbers of shots and lengths of shots is that something in the beauty of the numbers, its kind of mathematical sense of self-reference, will seem somehow stronger than our actual experience of the film. Now, in fact, it is very clear to me from reading the works of Cinemetrics that the goal is not that of substitution. But there is a certain way that I'm always worried people who are reading it will think, that's real science. There was a comedian from my hometown of Columbus, Ohio, back in the 60s named Jonathan Winters, who I always found quite amazing. And he had a wonderful routine about his own experience at Las Vegas, and that he never played, poker or blackjack, because there's always a dealer there, that he always preferred just working with the slot machines. He said, because I can tell proof when I see it, No subjectivity. The machine is cheating you outright, and mathematically. So it always worries me a little bit that people looking at lists of shots and the length of shots and comparisons of those will begin to see patterns that possibly have very little to do with their own experience. On the other hand, the hope, the expectation, is precisely that the numbers will allow us not only to be precise in describing our experience, but to look at it from another point of view, to test it in a certain way, and to relate it to patterns of numbers that appear. Now, Yuri has mentioned that I am one of the culprits in starting this kind of counting of shots. And one of the things I did do in my study, which was based on my dissertation on D.W. Griffith's biograph films, is to compare the number of shots in the films from his career starting in the latter part of 1908 through to the middle of 1913, during which time he made almost 500 films. Now, one of the great things about this population, to use the statistical term, is that it is fairly standard. The distribution and exhibition system of the time basically favored films of one reel, which is 1,000 feet. Now, not all the films were 1,000 feet, but most of them tried to be very close to it, so that there's a certain kind of similarity in the length of films. One that, of course, since we know the length of most of these films, because also the other thing is that most of them exist, at least in copyright form, that we can actually measure it. And it was fascinating to see, and other people had observed it before, but again, maybe not with so many examples. I did see all the existing films, was that his first film, The Adventures of Dolly, from 1908, has only 13 shots. By 1911, with The Lone-Dale Operator, which we're going to look at the climax of, which is slightly longer, it's still one reel, but Adventures of Dolly was a kind of short reel, he had about 96 shots. So that this enormous increase, almost tenfold, absolutely had something to do with the style of his film and with the impact that they had on audiences and on other filmmakers, as Yuri indicated from the famous article in the Moving Picture World. A lot of people felt this was terrible, but in fact, as often happens, films that are decried as terrible in the media very often are exactly the ones that are most influential. So I just want to show you, I know most of you know this, but the climax of The Lone-Dale Operator, so that we can get the sense not only of the pattern that is there centrally in the cutting between various locations, its narrative role in creating suspense, and also the way that, I'm not going to enter into an analysis by numbers, but our sense, I think, immediately that if we measure these individual shots, and obviously if we count the total amount, we do see something about a change in film history from 1908 to 1913. So if we could get that sequence from Lone-Dale Operator. Again, if we could bring the lights down just a little bit. The plot of The Lone-Dale Operator is that a woman in charge of a desolate telegraph station and train station has the payroll in her office. A couple of tramps notice this and try to steal it, but she telegraphs to her boyfriend engineer that she's in danger, and he is racing to the rescue. And you can see the way that Griffith is not just parallel editing between two locations, but between several and several points of view. So we have the engine, which is tinted red because of the, the furnace that would be powering it. The track, which is blue because it's night. The outer office, which is kind of a neutral color. Now the inner office is dark because she turned off the light, precisely because she doesn't want the tramps to see clearly what she has in her hand. Of course, the change in tinting indicates the turning on of the lamp. So, a film like this, clearly, even while you're watching it, I think you have the sense of tempo, that there's a regularity, a proportion between the length of shots, that there's a kind of rhythm going on, and of course, being able to actually count the frames, to count the numbers of shots, and so on, will give us some sense of this type of tempo, rather than just a kind of subjective impression, which of course is where we start, in a very precise and I think important manner. At the same time, though, oh, and I just might mention, last night showed this rather odd film to a group of interested students and faculty, Gamer, and it was extremely useful to know that, in fact, its average shot length was 2 seconds, and its median shot length was 1.7. And so, and then I said, so Yuri, what do you think of that? And he went, it's fast. And obviously, all of us knew that. But being able to realize it really is very fast, and to compare it to others, and just to try to think, what is it like when your medium, your most frequent shot is less than 2 seconds in terms of tempo and, stimulation of the audience, a whole series of things. I might add, though, that there is this kind of sense that how do we combine these scientific things, again, this idea of I know proof when I see it, with our very complex involvement in narrative and so on. And I can't help but recall a story told to me by my friend Ismael Javier in Sao Paulo, that when he gave, back in the 70s, the first talk on semiotics to the Brazilian Society of Film Studies, that somebody raised their hand and said, this is so strange. He says, it sounds partly like science and partly like macumba, which of course is the native Brazilian version of African-American spirituality, greatly involved in magic and, at least in the sensational image, licking blood. But how does that sense of kind of magical transformation, interrelate to something like the graphs that that Cinemetrics comes up with? And this one, I think, is Easy Virtue. Does it say? I can't. I know it was. I think it is. It's either Easy Virtue or Skin Game by both the early Hitchcock films. And this is where both I'm not sure if I understand and I'm not sure if I follow. In other words, in both sense. I'm not sure I'm getting it, but I'm not sure even if I did that I would follow along with it. Which is that to some extent that rhythm, that sense that we get in something like, well, in every film, but obviously in films where there's a powerful sense of alternation, like Lone Dale Operator, can then be graphed. Now, what if I understand this correctly, what the red line is representing is the general pattern of the white lines, which are the very specific shot lengths of individual shots. And so we get the sense that through the succession, and I think this is the whole film of Easy Virtue, that we get this so that there are dips and mountains and valleys, and a general kind of around the middle, rise. Now, this hints towards something that I think is quite exciting, but I'm also not sure I'm not sure I follow in both senses, as I say, which is that we might begin to find patterns that repeat again and again. In other words, in particular directors, in particular genres, particular historical periods, or even throughout certain forms of narrative film. And Yuri Sivin, who's done some very interesting speculation in this direction, at one point, for instance, because he finds that there is generally a kind of hump, pattern to this, relates this to traditional patterns that have been drawn up by literary critics of how climaxes occur, and kind of is saying, raising the issue without necessarily claiming it, that maybe these are similar. This is what worries me a little bit, is it seems to me that mathematically derived graphs are very different from, in effect, what we'd have to say descriptive graphs that are explaining climaxes, not lengths. And there is an immediate correlation that is being kind of unspoken, that for Yuri, shorter shot lengths, and particularly a grouping of shorter shot lengths, will indicate climaxes. I'm not so sure that's always true. I mean, I'm not sure it's not sometimes true, and it's certainly something that we can research and find out. But it worries me that kind of because, we have a kind of similarity visually, that the similarities can seem to be producing knowledge. Now, I'm sure this is partly my ignorance, because I know statistic people are, not only do they know a lot more about statistics than me, but they're not fools, and they've thought about this. But what exactly in this kind of meeting between disciplines and interacting of languages, there's always a kind of sorting out. Is the new discipline science? Is it macumba? Is it something that will work, or something that just has a kind of magical rhetorical effect? I know proof when I see it. At the same time, though, if I'm raising skepticism here, I also want to indicate how important it is to keep an open mind. Whenever disciplines come together, the point that is hardest is terminology. And when I look at the Cinemetrics site, I immediately go, well, what is kernel density? What is smoothing? What is, there's a whole series of unfamiliar terms which are frustrating to me, because not knowing something is frustrating. But of course, not knowing something is not an excuse for not knowing something. And I'm often recall there's a wonderful series of conferences that has been carried on for several years called Orphans, in which archivists and film scholars and filmmakers get together and look at films that have been neglected. But there's always a kind of overlap in phraseology. And of course, cinema, in its developing its own methods, cinema studies, has developed its own vocabulary. And one of the words which indeed Jean Mitry, one of the great film theorists and film historians, pronounced he would never use because it was indigestible, is the word diegesis, which is actually a very easily defined and useful term. But I remember going to one of the first orphans and hearing an archivist get up, and she looked out at the audience and went, diegesis. I just wanted to say that, you know. And of course everybody laughed, and of course everybody who had the term in their paper became embarrassed. But then a theorist got up for the next paper and said, I just want to announce that my paper is was 34% shrunk, and so I sent it through a wet gate printer, which of course are technical terms for archivists, which again means something very specific. But if you don't know what a wet gate printer is, if you don't know how films shrink, can sound like some type of macumba. So my point is very much that even though, you know, some of my suspicions here I think have to do with very carefully working together this interaction between the tools and the nature of number and the nature of the moving image, that by no means do I think we should be not going there, even if we have to go there very carefully. So, thank you.